When you're talking about criticizing promoters, there's things to criticize promoters about, but their fighters getting beat, from me, is not one of the things that should be criticized about a promoter, because that means the promoter is making fights that are risky even for his own stable, and he's prioritizing the health of the sport.
Welcome, everyone, to Boxing Scene's top stories only on ProBox TV, your boxing channel. I am George DeMatteis. Quick reminder to download the ProBox TV app where apps are available. Well, Oscar De La Hoya made some interesting comments on his Clapback Thursday episode on Instagram, talking about boxers and fighters and their roles in the current state of boxing. Here's what he had to say.
Boxing has been in hibernation. It's like a sleeping bear. Boxing has been the most popular sport since the beginning of time. Lately, it's been Mayweather versus McGregor, who fought in the ring, not the octagon, because boxing is king. But we have to get our shit together. Fighters are not daring to be great, and we are stuck accepting mediocre fights.
Come on, man.
Look, being a fighter and now a promoter, knowing the ins and outs because I'm in it, I have to say it's the fighters who are killing the sport.
All right, those are the words of Oscar De La Hoya on his Instagram account. Paulie, what are your thoughts on what Oscar said?
He's got some points. I mean, I've complained about similar stuff. There is a, you got to go keep in mind this. He is a promoter, so, you got to take things with a grain of salt to a degree. But I find myself agreeing with a lot of Oscar's clapbacks. He's comes off pretty genuine because he has been a fighter as well. But in some cases, you also got to keep in mind he puts his promoter hat on, and so it can kind of go both ways. He's right, in my opinion, about this. I've complained about the same kind of stuff. Guys worried about more their own personal brand than they are about the health of the sport. And so they're trying to, basically get themselves ahead, even if it is at the expense of the brand that is the sport of boxing. But I remember a couple of clapbacks ago, Oscar actually criticizing Eddie Hearn for his fighters not winning all the time, right? Or being even on a losing streak, so on, so to speak. That kind of thing happens when you make the fights. I mean, granted, if it was up to Eddie, I'm sure he would make all those fights, but, it's because Turkey Al-Sheikh money comes in, so, that kind of money has a way of motivating you to make riskier fights than you normally would. So I understand it. But then, at the same time, when you have a promoter that does make all the risk fights, if your fighters are on 15, 20 fight unbeaten streaks, you're not supposed to get your fighters beat, obviously. Nobody wants to do that. But if they're on these kind of crazy unbeaten streaks, it's probably because, some guys are being avoided there. It's most of the time that's going to be the case, So when you're talking about criticizing promoters, there's things to criticize promoters about. But their fighters getting beat, from me, is not one of the things that should be criticized about a promoter, because that means the promoter is making fights that are risky even for his own stable, and he's prioritizing the health of the sport rather than personal brands of fighters. And so, I agree with some of the things Oscar says, but at the same time, like I said, when the shoe's on the other foot, sometimes Oscar isn't always playing it the same way. Like I said, he's a promoter. He's an ex-fighter, so from one perspective, he makes sense. But then from the other perspective, he puts his promoter hat on, trying to talk about the same thing, and that doesn't make any sense all the time.
Yeah, Chris, what did you make of De La Hoya's comments?
Yeah, I agree with you, Champ. I think he did make a lot of really solid points, and there's a lot of things that I agree with. But it's funny, De La Hoya never misses an opportunity to pat himself on the back, even though it's called Clapback Thursday. Because he's saying that, listen, when I was a fighter, we all fought each other.
Could be Pat Back Thursday too, right?
It could be that as well, because he never misses an opportunity. But it's absolutely true. I mean, when Oscar was in his heyday, he fought everybody. And those guys didn't mind losing. You're talking about the Tito Trinidad, you're talking about Oscar De La Hoya, Pernell Whitaker. Those guys all fought each other. Fernando Vargas, these guys all fought. Shane Mosley, Bernard Hopkins throughout the middleweight tournaments. These guys were always trying to get the biggest fights possible. You don't see the same kind of avoidance like you see now. And he kind of blames the Mayweather effect, having that I think that's part of it too. So, again, made some really, really good points. But also, Oscar's been retired for quite some time. He's been a promoter we're looking at like 20 years now. How is this just coming out now? It's a really odd timing for him to mention that the sport is hibernating, because the sport's probably in one of its heydays at the moment, partly due to Turkey Al-Sheikh and the Riyadh season of revitalizing the heavyweight division more specifically, but also making a lot of fights that we've been clamoring for that just weren't available. based on money, based on whatever, on promoters not being able to work with each other. So at this point right now, I think we're seeing a lot more of the fights being made that used to be kind of off limits because they were across the street from each other. So timing-wise, it's a little odd that Oscar's bringing this up now. But in terms of what he's saying and the fighters, listen, I was always in control of my career. There was no one telling me who I could and couldn't fight. I always wanted to fight the best people around me. I always saw myself as being a world champion. I want to fight the best available. And there are some guys out there that are like that. But it seems like they're few and far between these days. David Benavidez comes to mind, a guy who wants to fight everybody. And listen, David Benavidez might take a loss. He's got a really tough fight coming up with Morrell. Tim Tszyu was a guy that we were like, hey, man, this guy wants to fight. Everybody wants to fight all the smoke. He's got 2 back-to-back losses now. Now, do we write that guy off? Or do we change the script and allow fighters to take risks, take losses, and still come back? That is what I believe is the most healthy version of this sport, which we had in the 80s and the 90s. Once the 2000s came, things kind of changed. We're not seeing that everyone is beholden to the almighty O at the end of their record. So I believe there is a shift getting away from that. But I think a lot of that, as Oscar said, does fall on the fighters not taking the opportunities that are available to them or pushing to make these fights. Listen, we wanted Crawford-Spence forever. Who made that fight? Those guys did. They literally called each other and made the fight up. So I think fighters need to step in the driver's seat a little more of their own careers.
And he certainly mentioned that era of the 80s and 90s in that clapback and equated it to supermodels and BBLs, which is really weird. But
he's the gift that keeps giving when it comes to comedy.
It definitely is. It is a funny post for sure. But let's talk about the comments he made, Chris, when it came to Jake Paul and that this fight against Mike Tyson was scripted. And he would go on to say, who's next for Jake Paul? Joe Biden. I mean, he was really funny with that. What do you make of him saying that there might have been some other things at play when it came to the Jake Paul-Mike Tyson fight?
Well, I don't think it was scripted. I don't agree with Oscar in that sense, but I do agree that the fight was awful. The fight was nearly unwatchable. It was low-level novice stuff, from Jake Paul, and it was a 58-year-old man who hasn't been training, guys. He literally almost died of an ulcer 3 months ago, and before that, I see him walking around Boca. He's not a guy who stays in the gym and has been fit for the last 20 years outside of his career like I have been. I've stayed in shape. He wasn't that kind of guy. So for him literally to get off the couch in 3 months and jump in there and go 8 rounds with Jake Paul, we're looking at a 58-year-old man coming off the couch, and Jake Paul, who's obviously pretty novice at this sport at this point, even though he's had such great trainers over the years. But yeah, I agree with Oscar in terms of that, and in terms of the fight not being very good. But in terms of being scripted or there was some kind of behind-the-scenes contract, that's all nonsense.
Yeah, Paulie, what do you make of the comments there of Oscar De La Hoya, Jake Paul? It's scripted. He also did shout out Amanda Serrano and Katie Taylor for the fight that they put on as well. So Oscar did give them props with that as well.
Yeah, that's like I said already. It's basically he's putting his promoter hat on. So when he's involved with something, it gets a lot of praise. When he's not involved with something, he'll throw a couple of daggers into the back. He's right about the era of boxing was, everybody used to fight each other and so on and so forth. But like the champ said, Chris, you make a great point when you talk about, we have fighters fighting each other now too. A lot of it has to do with Turkey Al-Sheikh money, but regardless, it is happening, and we got to be thankful for that. But I also see the other angle of boxing, which wasn't around at the other era when fighters were fighting each other, which is the YouTuber era, which is, the Jake Pauls of the world getting a lot of attention, and the KSIs of the world getting a lot of attention for these, sort of gimmick fights, which, again, are not scripted, but, you get to the point where you're so hallucinatory as a boxing fan or even a casual that you don't really know what to do. It's funny. I felt like I was watching Dumb and Dumber when I'd see some of these contacts going back and forth, because the Jake Paul fans make like he was carrying Mike Tyson, and then the boxing fans who staggered me with the hallucinatory mindsets that they had too. I thought they were a little bit smarter than this. They were on the other side saying, the 58-year-old Tyson was carrying Jake Paul. I just think, you end up falling into this bottomless pit of idiocracy when you start doing that, and you got to stick with the point. But regardless, it gives somebody like Oscar a chance to make that kind of comment, because he realizes he's got his finger on the pulse, so to speak, and he's saying, okay, a lot of people feel this way. It's a chance for me to criticize it, even if I probably don't even believe what I'm going to say. And I think that, in that regard, when he's talking about criticizing this or some of the things he says, you got to keep in mind the promoter's hat. Bob Arum does this all the time. You know what I mean? If it's got to do with one of his fighters, he'll spin it in a positive way. But if it's something he's got nothing to do with, all of a sudden, even if it's good for everybody else, he'll figure out how to misrepresent it in a negative way. It's just promoters competing with one another. It's good today, it's not good tomorrow unless you're involved with it, right? And I think that's more to do with why Oscar's criticizing some of the other stuff. And yeah, of course, Serrano Taylor, that was a good fight. We're not going to disagree on that. Ramos and Barrios, nobody's disagreeing on that either. That's just, par for the course.
And you talk about promoter's hat. He's literally wearing a Golden Boy Promotions hat in the Clapback Thursday video. So Oscar De La Hoya, on Thursdays, he is the king of the internet because he just completely destroys it on Instagram. And of course, if anything interesting happens, maybe next Thursday, although that's Thanksgiving, we will talk about it here on Top Stories. I'd like to remind you to scan the QR code, like, subscribe, and leave your comments on our YouTube channel. Download the ProBox TV app, where apps are available, because you can catch the next edition of our Contender Series. December 7th, we are back in Ireland. Should be a great fight card on December 7th. You can watch it on the app and on YouTube as well. I'm George DeMatteis, and this is Boxing Scene's Top Stories.
ProBox TV Contender Series. On December 7th, look for an all-out Irish war as Dylan the Real Deal Moran battles Tyrone the Mighty Kelt McKenna at the top of a stacked ProBox-worthy card.
For more ProBox TV, scan the QR code on the screen or go to the App Store and Google Play. ProBox TV, your boxing channel.